6 weeks. That was the number Adelaide Kingsley kept repeating to herself as she stood on the dry dock platform above the Windermere Hall, the hull suspended in its cradle like something held its breath along with the crowd around it. 6 weeks to the relaunch gala. 9 figures riding on a signature that would not happen if the ship beneath her did not sail clean and true in front of the cameras. Why does the restoration team's own paperwork say the Windermere Hall's hull design has no known architect, when the wood itself seems to remember someone's hand? She had asked the question 3 times already that morning to 3 different engineers and received 3 versions of the same shrug. "Who designed this masterpiece?" she said again, louder now, addressing the dozen naval architects assembled below her like a jury she meant to indict. Because whoever it was drew a hull that is failing under conditions it was never supposed to fail under, and I would very much like to speak with them before this becomes public. Silence answered her, the particular silence of professionals who each privately hoped someone else would break it first. Rupert Winthrop, her lead architect, opened his mouth to offer another qualification, another hedge dressed up as expertise. He did not get the chance. Near the back of the gathered crew, past the polished shoes and the department heads, a man in a faded canvas jacket with a frayed left cuff lifted his hand, unhurried, the way a person raises a hand not to be noticed but simply because the truth requires an answer. Adelaide looked at him the way she looked at anything she had not budgeted for. "You," she said. "Your maintenance." It was not a question. Graham Sawyer said nothing yet. He only stood there, hands still raised, waiting for her to actually ask him the question instead of asking it at the room. Stay through to the end for the moment the paperwork finally tells the truth. Because right now, in the file cabinets 3 floors above that dry dock, in a folder marked with the ship's registration number, there was no name at all where an architect's should have been. A blank space where a man's entire career had once lived, quietly erased, the way water erases a footprint on a dock without anyone needing to lie about it happening. 4 hours before any of that, in a small rented house, 11 minutes from the yard, the day had started the way it always started, with 2 knocks on Iris's door, never 3, and the particular quiet of a father who had learned exactly how much noise a 9-year-old could tolerate before 7 in the morning. Graham stood in the doorway a moment, watching her surface from sleep in stages, one arm first, then a squint, then the full recognition of him. "Pancakes or the fast cereal," he said, and she said cereal, because it was a school day, and school days ran on speed rather than ceremony. He moved through the kitchen with the same unhurried hands. He moved through everything, cracking nothing, spilling nothing. The coffee poured before the kettle had finished its complaint. Iris's lunch went into its container in an order that had become ritual without either of them naming it. The sandwich first, then the apple slices in their own small compartment, then the sticker on the lid, a cloud with a face she had picked out herself from a sheet of 100 and insisted on, out of all of them, because the others look worried. He never questioned her logic. He simply pressed the sticker flat with his thumb, the same corner every morning, and set the container by her backpack. Before he left for the yard, he did what he did every morning without exception. He crouched by the canvas roll of drafting tools that lived by the front door, the one with the leather ties gone soft from age, and he opened it part way, not all the way, just enough to see the corner of a child's pencil drawing tucked against the tools. Iris's rendering of a sailboat, done in a steadier hand than most 6-year-olds could manage, drawn back when she was small enough to still believe boats were simple things. Beneath it, folded into eighths so old the creases had gone soft as cloth, sat the onion skin hull plan he never spoke about to anyone, not even her. He did not open it. He knew what it said without looking. A woman's handwriting, small and exact, noting cure times in the margin the way she noted everything, with the confidence of someone who had spent her whole life trusting chemistry to behave if you respected it. He touched the roll once, closed it, and stood. "Is it the pretty one today?" Iris asked, meaning the yacht, because he had mentioned it twice this week already, more than he usually mentioned any job. "It's an old one," he said. "Somebody built her right a long time ago. She just needs somebody to remember how." "Did you know them?" "The somebody?" Graham paused at the door, hand on the frame, the question landing somewhere he did not let show on his face. "I used to," he said, and left it there, because that was as much of the truth as the morning required, and Iris, who mirrored his stillness the way she mirrored everything about him, did not ask a second question. She simply nodded, satisfied, the way a person nods when they already understand more than they're saying. The yard smelled the way it always smelled at 7:40. Cut cedar, hot resin, the particular sourness of low tide beneath the pilings. Graham had been sanding a companionway rail for 3 days when Adelaide Kingsley's car came through the gate, and the whole crew straightened the way men straighten when money walks toward them. She toured the hull with Rupert Winthrop at her elbow, nodding at figures she mostly understood and some she didn't, until she reached the section where Graham knelt with his palm flat against the planking, not measuring anything, just resting his hand there the way a person rests a hand on a horse's neck to feel whether it's calm. "What is he doing?" Adelaide asked Rupert, not Graham, as though he were a fixture rather than a man 3 feet away. Ma'am, that's yard labor, general maintenance." Rupert said it the way you'd clarify a mislabeled invoice. Graham looked up without standing. "The cure schedule on this section runs short," he said quietly, the words aimed at no one in particular. 2 days, maybe 3. At this humidity it needs longer, or the resin never fully sets past the surface. Adelaide's expression did not change so much as it closed, like a door someone had decided not to answer. "Let's be efficient about this," she said. "I have a naval architecture team with degrees from 4 countries telling me the schedule is correct. I don't need a guess from someone holding a sanding block." She turned to Rupert. "Reassign him. Clean up, storage, whatever keeps him away from anything load-bearing." Rupert, visibly relieved to have permission to agree with her, nodded and told Graham as much in front of the crew, in the flat voice men use when they want witnesses to their obedience. Graham stood, brushed the dust from his knees, and said nothing at all. No protest, no explanation, only the particular stillness of a man who had been dismissed before and knew that arguing with the wrong ears wasted breath better spent elsewhere. He picked up a broom instead of a sanding block and went to work, and if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed he was still listening to the hull even as he swept beneath it, the way another man might listen for a heartbeat through a wall. Over the following days, Graham did the work he'd been assigned without complaint, and the work no one had assigned him without announcement. He swept, he hauled scrap, he coiled lines nobody thanked him for coiling. And in the gaps between, when the crew had moved on to lunch or to some other section of the hull, he ran his palm along the planking the way another man might run a hand along a sleeping animal's flank, feeling for the places where the wood held tension it shouldn't. He tapped sections with 2 knuckles, listening to the tone come back, a habit that made Rupert Winthrop roll his eyes the first time he caught it and say nothing after that, mostly because he had no name for what he was watching and found it easier to pretend he hadn't seen it. Graham never used a gauge where his hand would do. He noted privately that one section forward of the mast step rang a half-tone flatter than it should, the sound of resin that had gone glassy on the surface while staying soft beneath, a hollowness only a person who had spent years listening for it would recognize as wrong rather than simply quiet. Adelaide came through twice more that week, her visits clipped and efficient, her eyes skating over Graham the way eyes skate over a chair in a room they have already furnished in their mind. She asked the engineers pointed questions about the relaunch timeline and got polished answers that reassured her exactly as much as they were designed to. She did not ask the man with the broom anything, because in her accounting, he had already been asked and answered and filed underhandled. It was Miles Callahan, the floor supervisor, who noticed what she didn't. He'd known Graham 6 years, since the day he'd hired him off a 2-line resume and a handshake that told him more than the resume had, and he'd never pushed for the rest of the story, because some men's silence was a kind of dignity you didn't disturb. But he watched Graham tap that hollow section 3 days running, watched him frown the particular frown of a man doing arithmetic in his head rather than his notebook, and on the 3rd evening, as the crew filed out past the gate, Miles fell into step beside him. "You planning on saying anything about that spot forward of the mast step?" Miles said, not really a question. "Not yet. Because you're not sure, or because nobody's going to listen if you do." Graham considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, without performing the consideration for anyone's benefit. "Both," he said. Miles nodded, satisfied with an answer that wasn't really an answer, and said only, You know, I've still got your old firm's newsletter in a drawer somewhere, from before the merger. Kept it because I liked the boats in it. He let that sit a moment, watching Graham's face for a reaction that didn't come, and then added gently, as though setting down something fragile, "Man-designed boats like that doesn't forget how to hear one talking to him. Figured you'd get around to saying something eventually." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply clapped Graham once on the shoulder, the way men do when they mean a great deal more than the gesture suggests, and walked on toward his truck, leaving Graham standing in the half-dark beside a hull that, unbeknownst to anyone watching the calendar count down toward 6 weeks, was already failing exactly where he'd said it would. The scheduled stress test came on a gray Tuesday morning, with Adelaide Kingsley and 4 members of her board assembled on the platform above the cradle, cameras from the marketing team already rehearsing angles for a triumph that hadn't happened yet. The hydraulic rig groaned the hull through its calculated flex, the numbers scrolling green across a technician's laptop, until, at 11% past the target load, a sound went through the wood that every person on that platform felt in their sternum before they understood it in their ears. A crack, small, contained, but wrong. The green numbers turned red. Rupert Winthrop went pale in the particular way of a man watching his own competence evaporate in real time, and Adelaide's face did the thing it did when a number failed to behave. It went perfectly, dangerously calm. "Somebody explain this," she said, to no one, to everyone. Graham was already walking toward the hull before she finished the sentence. Broom left leaning where he'd been standing, his unhurried hands going still the moment he reached the planking, the way they always went still right before he spoke. He knelt at the section forward of the mast step and pressed his palm flat, then tapped twice with 2 knuckles, listening to a tone the instruments had already told everyone was fine. "It's not the design," he said. "It's the cure. This section was rushed 2, maybe 3 days short, same as I said last week. Resins glassed over on the surface and stayed soft underneath. Looks solid to a gauge, isn't solid to a load." He said it the way a man reads a thermometer, without triumph, without apology. "And you know this how?" Adelaide said, and it was not quite contempt anymore, not quite belief either, something suspended between the two. Graham did not answer with words first. He reached instead for the section of the original lines plan mounted under glass near the cradle, the framed onion skin sheet the marketing team used for photographs, its ink faded to the color of weak tea. He turned it slightly toward the gray daylight and pointed, not at the drafted lines everyone had looked at 100 times, but at a place beneath the varnish where the light caught differently. A faint, ghosted pencil correction, decades old, that had been sealed under the finish rather than erased. A number, a cure specification, in a hand that matched, stroke for stroke, the way a man writes when he is certain of what he is fixing. "That's mine," Graham said. 4 words. The whole platform went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with hydraulics. It was Miles Callahan who broke it, stepping forward without being asked, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who has decided the moment for keeping confidence has passed. "Before the merger," he said to Adelaide directly, "the firm that drew this hull was run by 4 people. Graham Sawyer was the one who drew the lines. I've known it 6 years and kept it because it wasn't my story to tell. It's his." Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Adelaide Kingsley looked at the broom leaning against the hull, and then at the man who had been sweeping beneath it, and for the first time in the 6 weeks since the relaunch clock had started counting down, she did not know what to say at all. By the following afternoon, Adelaide had pulled Graham's personnel file herself, expecting to find, at minimum, an old design credit she could restore with a press release and a photograph. What she found instead sat in her hands like a document written about a different man entirely. Termination, 8 years prior, listed under cause, no design credit anywhere in the record, no mention of the firm's acquisition, no trace that Graham Sawyer had ever drawn so much as a deck cleat for the company that now bore his hull as its flagship. The contradiction between the file and the wood itself sat in her office like a smell she couldn't place. She read it 3 times, the way a person rereads a number hoping it will change, and it never did. She was still holding it when Rupert Winthrop knocked, his own face carrying a different kind of unease. He'd spent the morning, unprompted, going back through the structural consultants' reports commissioned ahead of the gala, the routine paperwork nobody read past the summary page, and had found, buried in an appendix unsigned by anyone senior enough to matter, an independent surveyor's recommendation filed 11 weeks earlier, advising against sailing the Windermere Hull at all until further testing could confirm the hull's integrity under sustained load. It had never reached the board. It had never reached Adelaide. "This should have stopped the gala planning cold," Rupert said, setting it on her desk the way you'd set down something that might still be live. Someone decided it wouldn't. Adelaide looked at the two documents side by side, the man with no design credit who had built the ship, and the warning that had never been allowed to reach her, and felt, for the first time since she had inherited her father's company, the particular vertigo of realizing the paperwork she'd trusted her whole career had been lying to her in two directions at once, and that the nine-figure signing 6 weeks away now rested on a hull nobody had actually cleared to sail. Rupert did not sleep well that week, and it showed. He'd spent 2 nights in the records room with a desk lamp and a stack of purchase orders, cross-checking them against a spec sheet he'd found in the archived design files, a spec sheet with Graham's initials at the bottom, dated a decade back, listing a specific 2-part marine resin by name and cure ratio. What he found, entered into the procurement system 4 months after Graham's termination, was a different compound entirely, cheaper, faster curing, approved by a signature that wasn't an engineer's at all. He brought it to Graham before he brought it to anyone else, some instinct telling him the man deserved to see it first. Graham studied the order form for a long moment, his face doing very little, though something behind it moved the way still water moves when a stone finally reaches bottom. "This isn't what I specified," he said. "Not close. This cures faster, cheaper, and it doesn't hold the flex load past a certain threshold, which is exactly what failed on the platform." "Someone swapped it after you left," Rupert said, "on purpose." They worked through it together after that, the convertible skeptic and the man he'd once dismissed, moving through digitized signature logs the way 2 men might move through a house they suspected of hiding something in the walls. The termination record bore a signature meant to read as procedural, a rubber stamp scrawl nobody looks at twice, until Rupert enlarged it and set it beside the resin substitution order, and the two matched with an exactness that made argument unnecessary. Neither belonged to Adelaide. Neither belonged to any engineer on the design team. Both belonged to Garrett Aldington, Chief Operating Officer of Kingsley Maritime Holdings, a man whose name appeared on nothing except approvals nobody was meant to scrutinize. "Why would the COO care what resin goes in a hull?" Rupert said, half to himself, and then, slower, answering his own question the way people do when the shape of a thing finally resolves. Unless he needed it to fail. A single afternoon of quiet digging, the kind that required no drama at all, turned up the rest. A shell entity 3 names removed from Garrett's own, holding a minority stake in a rival restoration yard 40 miles up the coast, one that had been quietly bidding for Kingsley Maritime's restoration contracts for years and losing every time. A failed, publicly humiliating relaunch of the Windermere Hull would not simply cost Kingsley Maritime its gala. It would send every future contract and the fortune behind them sliding toward Garrett's other investment, with Garrett himself positioned to recommend the switch personally, regretfully, as the responsible steward of the board's money. He had erased Graham's name to bury the original specification. He had substituted the resin to guarantee, quietly and patiently, over 8 years, that the day would eventually come when the hull remembered what had been done to it. The boardroom on the top floor of Kingsley Maritime's headquarters had windows facing the harbor, and Adelaide had arranged the chairs so that the Windermere Hull itself was visible over Garrett Aldington's shoulder, while Rupert laid the documents across the table one at a time. The spec sheet, the substitution order, the enlarged signatures set side by side, the shell entities filing with Garrett's name buried 3 lines down. Garrett looked at each one in turn and said nothing, and offered no version of events that contradicted what the paper already said plainly enough on its own. There was no confession scene, no raised voice, no moment of theatrical collapse, only a man watching 8 quiet years of arithmetic come due at once, and choosing, in the end, to say only that he'd wanted to speak with his attorney before anything further was discussed. Security walked him out through a side door most employees didn't know existed, and the room he left behind felt, for a moment, larger than it had with him in it. Adelaide waited until the door closed before she turned to Graham, who stood near the window with his canvas jacket still faintly dusted with sanding residue, as though he'd come straight from work, because in fact he had. "I looked at your jacket before I looked at your hands," she said. It was not an excuse dressed up as an explanation. It was simply the failure, named plainly, the way the profile of a person who has decided not to hide anymore tends to speak. "I had a file that told me you were nobody, and I believed the file faster than I believed the ship. That's on me, not the paperwork. Me." She did not soften it further, and did not need to. "I want to give you full credit, publicly, a formal position on the design team, and a settlement that accounts for 8 years you shouldn't have lost. Whatever figure makes it right, name it." Graham was quiet a moment. The particular stillness that came before anything he said mattered. "I don't want the title," he said, "or the money. My name back on the record is enough, the actual record, not a press release, and I want whoever comes after me protected. A real audit trail on resin specs, sign-offs that can't hide behind a stamp, a way for the next person who notices something wrong to be heard the first time, not the 5th. He paused, and something in his face eased, just slightly, the way a held breath eases. "That's the whole ask." It was Rupert, going through the design archive that evening to prepare Graham's restored file, who found the canvas drafting roll among Graham's things where he'd left it in the yard office, and inside it, tucked behind the child's old pencil drawing of a sailboat, the onion skin hull plan folded into its 8 soft creases. In the margin, in a hand steadier and finer than Graham's own, was the note that had actually caught the substitution days earlier, when Graham first ran the numbers against instinct alone. A cure ratio, a chemist's shorthand, and beside it, small, easy-to-miss, initials that weren't his, Delphine's. His late wife had drafted that margin note over a decade ago, checking his work the way she checked everything, out of love disguised as rigor. And it was her arithmetic, more than any instrument on the yard floor, that had told him exactly how far off the substituted resin truly was. Graham used to say, a hull only failed at the seams where the builder had stopped paying attention. Delphine used to say a hull only fails where somebody stopped paying attention. And it was her sentence, resurfacing in his memory as he'd first knelt at that hollow section, that had told him precisely where to press his palm. 3 months later, on a clear morning with the harbor flat as glass, the Windermere Hall went out under her own sail for the first time since her restoration began, cutting a wake so clean the marketing photographers barely needed to adjust their angles. On her transom, beneath the ship's name, a small brass builder's plate had been added, understated, correctly worded, listing the original design credit restored to the record it should never have left. Garrett Aldington's name no longer appeared anywhere in the company's files. The falsified termination had been struck and corrected, the resin specification restored to Graham's original ratio, the audit trail rebuilt from the keel up in every sense that mattered. Adelaide Kingsley stood on the dock during the launch and did not make a speech about it, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she'd done all year. Graham was not there to see the ship sail. He was home by then, kneeling by the front door with the canvas drafting roll open across his knees, refolding the onion skin hull plan along its original 8 creases, the paper soft enough now to fall into its old shape without resistance, the way a thing settles when it has finally been allowed to rest. He tucked it back beside the child's sailboat drawing, closed the roll, and carried it out to the truck, setting it on the bench seat exactly where it always sat, because some rituals don't need improving once they've done their job. Iris was waiting at the door with her backpack already on, one sock pulled higher than the other, and together they walked the 11 minutes to the school gate the way they walked it most mornings, unhurried, the two of them matching stride without either noticing they did it. If you believe quiet competence deserves to be seen before it's too late, you already understand why Graham never had to raise his voice. At the gate, Iris turned back once, the way she always did, and Graham lifted 2 fingers in a small, wordless wave he'd been giving her every morning for longer than either of them could now remember. And behind them, in the cab of the truck, the roll sat folded and waiting, exactly where it belonged.